Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining for today's special Bay Nature talk. It's great to see so many of you here. There's already almost 60 people, which is really exciting. Thanks for making time on your Wednesday lunch to join us for this conversation. My name is Leah Keener, and I'm Bay Nature's events coordinator. Those of you listening, if you're able, please turn your cameras on. We'd love to see your faces if possible. Would love to just engage with you for the next hour and see you as you tune in for this event. So if you're able, please turn your cameras on. Um, but I'll just introduce Bay Nature. Many of you probably already know Bay Nature as a quarterly print publication. We focus on conservation and nature topics that are all local to the 9 counties of the Bay Area. And in addition, we have our website, which publishes weekly online content that's news and also local to the Bay Area. And this piece is inspired by one of those pieces written by Jillian, who's going to be our moderator today. But in addition to our editorial content, we also are working on building up our events program with virtual and in-person events like this one. We have a series of hikes, bio blitzes, and virtual events like this, which dive deeper into the journalism that we produce as an editorial organization. So thank you all for joining for this special newsy edition of our virtual Bay Nature talk. And with that, I will turn it over to Jillian, who is our moderator for today and the author of the piece that inspired this whole event. And as you're listening, please enter your questions into the chat, and we will get to as many as possible at the end.
Thanks, Leah. Hi, I'm Jillian. I'm the writer of the Elkhorn Slough story for Bay Nature, though it's been written about very widely. And thank you all for joining. I'm sorry that it's about a very unfortunate event. And if anyone wants a recap of it or hasn't read the story yet, that's totally fine. Um, the fire that we're speaking about today happened at the Vistra Moss Landing Power Plant on January 16th, owned by Vistra Energy. It was formerly a PG&E power plant, changed hands a few times before it landed on Vistra Energy, which is a lithium-ion energy storage facility. The fire burned for 3 days. It consumed 75% of the plant, which housed 100,000 lithium-ion batteries. And these batteries don't generate energy themselves, actually, but they store excess solar or renewable energy during the day and deliver it to the grid at night or on less sunny days. So it was definitely a solution that came to the community as a green energy solution, as something that was going to be beneficial for the community and just the surrounding areas. But the fire did have extreme implications. It released contaminants that ended up miles away, affecting residents, and of course, on Elkhorn Slough. The plant is right at the mouth of the slough, and as many of you know, the slough is home to hundreds of important species, many of which are threatened, endangered, and of course, home to the otter sanctuary. But the reason why we even know about this in the first place, that we know that the contaminants ended up at Elkhorn Slough, is because of Ivano Aiello, who is here today. A week after the fire, with his team, he collected 100 soil samples within about a 2-mile radius of the plant over the course of about a few days, and the contaminants, nickel, manganese, and cobalt, were found at concentrations hundreds to thousands of times greater than when he last recorded them 2 years ago. And also with us is Wesley Heim, who we'll also introduce later, who is tracking how these metals are moving throughout the slough. And I also wanted to provide an update since the last time the story was published. Over the past few weeks, there has been a lot of news going on still. It's a very much a continuing story if anyone has been following the news. Um, there's been a lawsuit uh, on behalf of the Monterey County residents near and around the site who have experienced a lot of health effects, including shortness of breath, metallic tastes in their mouths, some people with mouth sores, some people claiming that lithium is being detected in their blood, according to different news reports. Um, so there's a lawsuit that was filed earlier this month that accuses Vistra Energy and also PG&E of failing to comply with safety measures and safety standards. that the design of the facility was faulty in the beginning, that the choice to use these batteries was dangerous, um, and also that they had an outdated water suppression system. So if anyone is interested about this suit, they can definitely dive more into that online. But that was just the broad overview of what's happening in terms of the legal. And in terms of the fire itself, that's also unfortunately not a story that has completely wrapped up. It reignited last week on February 18th and lasted for about a day. I spoke with the fire chief, and the temperatures are still unstable in one area of the building. About a third of the compromised batteries are accessible to firefighters and personnel. The rest of the building is still dangerous, and batteries can't be removed quite yet. They have to go through a delinking process, which I just learned about as well. Um, about a third of the batteries too are able to be delinked from each other, which means that they're separated from one another somehow to reduce their voltage. It doesn't prevent fires, but it um, prevents total catastrophe of a fire. So that's where we're at right now. A little bit of chaos still, but as we are Bay Nature, we're focused right now on what's happening at the slough, specifically, and the scientists trying to figure out what the impacts are on wildlife, on soils, on water quality. And that's why we've brought in these scientists from Moss Landing Marine Laboratory, and I'll give them time to introduce themselves, talk about the lab, which is just a mile away from the power plant, and their research before the fire and how their research has also changed after the fire. So, Ivano and Wesley, if you guys wanted to introduce yourselves, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jillian, and thank you for your introduction, and thank you all for coming today. It's nice to see so many people interested in our work here. So my name is Ivano Aiello. I'm a professor here at Moss Landing Marine Labs and department chair, and a geoscientist. So I study sediments, soils, and rocks. And yeah, Moss Landing Marine Labs is part of the CSU system. We are a master's program in marine science, and our administrative campus is San Jose State University. And yeah, so I guess I'll talk about the story after Wes introduces himself. Is that? Yeah.
Thanks, Ivano. Yeah, hi all. Thanks. It's really good to be here today and talk with you all. So I'm Wes Heim. I'm the director of the Marine Pollution Studies Lab at Moss Landing Marine Laboratory. And so my group is looking at trace metal transport and fate in the environment. We've done lots of work throughout the state looking at fish, water, and sediment and heavy metals. And I've been involved in lots of work around fish advisories. And so it was just, we're set up with all the instrumentation that we need to be looking at the environmental samples from this battery fire. And I also have a long background looking at mercury as well. That's kind of what got me started at the Marine Pollution Studies Laboratory. So there's some corollaries there as well with these heavy metals.
Thanks for the introductions. I wanted to know, Ivana was talking about this earlier, but your work has pretty much drastically changed after the fire. What was the nature of your work before the fire and after the fire?
My life has changed, not just my work. It's been I mean, the word is serendipity, meaning that I was working in the wetlands near the battery facility, barely knowing there was a battery storage facility. Honestly, I knew about it, but I had no idea how many batteries, what was going on there. I was really looking for other things, which is I'm part of this larger project to restore wetlands. So we are working in this beautiful place that's Alcorn Slough. I hope some of you have been there. It's just a fantastic place where, which is the home of many endangered species. It's a very delicate ecosystem. And over time, in the last 100 years, has been diked and drained. So part of the marshes have collapsed. So what we are trying to do is to restore marshes by adding sediments to those drawn mud flats and regrow, marsh plants and reestablish ecosystems. So that's what we were doing, marsh restoration. And and the part of the work is understanding what is the best recipe in terms of reproducing marshes. And so the recipe I'm talking about is the soil composition. So for many years, I've been looking at soil properties, physical properties, chemical properties, geotechnical properties, trying to understand how it compacts, how it changes over time. And lately, in the last few years, I've been also looking at the composition of the soil in terms of elemental composition, which is, we were trying to figure out whether there was a correlation between our ability to regrow, a pickle weed, essentially, marsh plants with soil properties. And so in 2023, together with my colleagues at the Alconslu Research Center, we covered the whole area and we sampled the soils for elemental composition. And the sampling includes also heavy metals, but I wasn't looking for heavy metals at all. I would, that wasn't my goal. But I was looking for manganese, maybe iron, but no other metals like nickel and cobalt. But I was measuring them, and then the fire happens, and so we get evacuated. So the power plant is really, I can see it through my window here. So on January 16, we got evacuated because of the fire, as you all know, and I went home, which is right out of the mandatory evacuation zone. So I was, basically, I didn't go that far. I sealed myself inside the house, as I was told, and after a few days, I came out, and then I went back to work because they told us that air was clean, everything's good, nothing to fear here. So I went back to my study sites, and when I walked there, I could see all this burned stuff all over the place. That was miles away from the power plant. I mean, there were like chunks of charred material, black things. And I started measuring the soil composition again. I was just curious to see whether there was any change. And it was clear, pretty much early on that some elements were off the chart compared to my previous measurement. And those elements are the one that then became, clearly related to the burning of the batteries, which are nickel, cobalt, and manganese. And and then I took samples from the soil and put it under my scanning electron microscope, and I could see those things. You can see them on the ground too. I mean, the larger pieces, but you can actually see the tiny metal particles also in the sediments. And so I kept measuring a larger area, and it became clear that not only there was this layer, thin layer of enriched and heavy metals, but also that the bullseye, the place where the concentrations were higher, wasn't next to the plant, but actually was a few miles away from it. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about this, but that's kind of how the whole thing started. And there's a signature in those elements that connects them directly to the fire. In other words, the relative concentration of these three metals is proportionally correlated. So when you find more of one, you find also more of the other one, which tells you they're all coming from the same source. And hold and behold, the battery material that was used in that storage facility matches what I'm finding on the ground. So there's a kind of a signature that you can trace just based on elemental ratios. I hope I'm not going too technical, but that's kind of, so there's a fingerprint that you can follow. And you can see them too. I mean, it's not, but one thing that I'll point out several times is that this wasn't an avalanche. It was a ashfall. So there's an airborne material. So, and the stuff is very tiny. So the way they make those batteries is about half of the battery, 40% of the battery in weight is made of heavy metals, this type of batteries here. So when they explode and they pop out, all these things just go on, some of those things go in the air, and then they fall out from the plume. And then they settle as, like little snowflakes. So they're scattered and they're very thin layer. So that's what we see at the very surface. Does it make sense? Is it?
And I know that you've detected these heavy metals at overwhelmingly dramatic rates. I was wondering if you've been able to do some more samples and do some more testing since January, and for you too, Wesley, what the nature of your work has been since since this finding?
Yeah, I mean, I think for myself, we were winding down a big statewide program, and all of a sudden I got a call from Ivano. You know, I also was evacuated from the fire, and I live up in Santa Cruz, unlike Ivano, so I was a little farther away and didn't really think too much of it. And you know, the wife and the kids were asking me, and I was like, no, I think we're pretty good here. You know, the direction of the plume and all of that. And then um, the next morning when the winds had changed, I walked out and I could smell metal and kind of the plastic smell. So I was like, wow, this is a lot wider spread than I thought it would be. And then I got a call from Ivano. So at my lab, we use what's called an ICP-MS instrument to do trace metal analysis. It's Ivano's, what I call his tricorder, can give you these really cool instantaneous reads of these metals at a thin film level, and then our instrument is it fills a footprint of about a 6 by 6 space. So it's a large instrument with really low detections of these metals, but it's a really accurate and precise way to look at metals. And so when he gave me the call to see if I'd run some of this stuff, you know, I was like, sure, yeah, we can do that. And so I was just, shocked at what we were finding as well. And it lined up right with Ivano's data. And so then at that point, it became clear that we were going to start, we were set up, again, fortuitous that we were set up to do this type of work. We've done this type of work in other environments up in San Francisco Bay, other places, maybe with mercury or other trace metals, but the processes are all kind of the same. The experiments that we're going to be setting up and the monitoring that we're doing, just we can transfer that right into Elkhorn Slough. And so, that since I got the call from Ivano, that's kind of where I've been focused on ever since, is just looking at, setting up some of this stuff. Some of the immediate work that we've done over the last couple of weeks was really looking at stormwater sampling. We want to see what these metals, if they're being mobilized. And so I've had teams out in, whenever we get that real pouring rain, we can get some connectivity from the surrounding watershed into the slough. And so we have those samples. Unfortunately, don't have any of those results back yet because of the time delay for the analysis. We don't get the instantaneous read. It's quite a laborious process to get to the final concentration data. And then we're also looking at deploying some mussels and bioindicators out in the slough, along with other groups that are collecting those types of samples. So really just at the initial stages of putting the framework in place to get answers for all these important questions of, like, how much was released, where's it at, is it moving, where's it going to end up, what happens to biota, other things, plants, as it's exposed to this material.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first question is the mass balance. Like, think about like an oil spill. You want to know how much oil is missing from the tank, how much you find in the ground. So that's the sort of thing we're trying to understand, how much of these heavy metals are present in Elkhorn Slough. And again, we're looking at a very small area. This is something that your audience should acknowledge. We're working on a very tiny, tiny. I mean, it's several miles, but still as a stamp. And as Wes described, the plume reached further away from where we work. I mean, from my house, I could see the smoke very clearly because I live only a few miles away from the power plant, and in Santa Cruz as well. So we don't know what we don't know, which is what happens outside this little tiny box where we can play as a scientist. And so the mass balance is the first thing. And so we don't know much about how much was actually burned. You said 75%. I heard different numbers, but really is how much of the heavy metals are missing. That's really the piece of the puzzle that I don't have that information. We know that at the time of the fire, there were about 7.8 million pounds of batteries in that facility specifically. And out of which, as I mentioned earlier, about 40% is heavy metal. So when you take the weight of a battery, that type of batteries, about 40% is heavy metal. So if you do a back on the envelope calculation, we're talking about 2 to 3 million pounds of heavy metals present at the time of the fire. 75% of that will be a couple million pounds of heavy metals. But that's a speculation, obviously, because I don't know how much is missing. So, if you can do that subtraction, go back and say, okay, what is left? Then you can say, okay, what is missing is when, in a fire. And metals don't disappear. It just doesn't happen that way. They melt, they might melt, but they don't disappear. So they have to go somewhere. And now what we're doing is to estimate how much metal those heavy metals are found in Elkins Slough. So this is something that we're doing right now. And now over time, we're looking at changes. So that's really important to monitor, what Wes was saying. Where is the stuff going? And we have data. You were asking about that. So we keep going back to the same sites and measuring. And both the very surface, but also the subsurface. So we're trying to understand whether there's any vertical movement of this metals. And we saw, what I can share with you is that after the major rain event at the end of the month, was the end of the month, yeah, we saw a dramatic drop overall in concentration at the surface. So the runoff obviously took some of those particles away. And they don't disappear though. So you're just moving things around. So they might have gone in the actual channel of the slough. I mean, that's where things are draining, most part of the slough. And then there's some evidence in some sites that some of the stuff is actually moving through this kind of settling, percolating through the sediment, although it will take much more work, more detailed work, but that's a possibility. And in some other places, we're actually seeing concentration increasing. And those are the places where you have tidal action on those mud flats. And then, these large ponds form, and they kind of concentrate the metals, and then eventually water evaporates. And so the leftover is the salty, heavy metal rich stuff. So we found that in some places they're really gone up, but they're very much like hot spots. And kind of makes sense. If the water cannot drain in the main channel, it just drains locally and then eventually accumulates things locally. I mean, it's a pretty, but we're seeing change. This is happening pretty fast. And in some sites, the concentration went back to baseline level already, just gone.
And Wesley, I know you mentioned before something about filter feeders, about putting oysters into the slough as bioindicators of heavy metals. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What sort of species are you? And I know that you are also working with other groups as well. Are you choosing to put into the slough in order to determine how life is being affected, how it's moving through the food web?
Yeah, I certainly can. I'm gonna shout out California Fish and Wildlife, their scientific collection permit department for this. After we got our group together and started kind of brainstorming ideas, I reached out to my contact there, and they approved a scientific collection permit for us within about 4 days of the submission of that. And you have to have a scientific collection permit to do any of this type of work in California, and that process, they usually take 3 or 4 months. So we really appreciated the department and how fast they responded. So for the permit I have, I'll speak to my work first, and then discuss what Elkhorn Slough Foundation group and Dr. Khan are doing. So for this permit, we're going to be collecting. We've collected clean California mussels from Montana de Oro, and then we bring them back to the lab and put them on our seawater table, and we get them equilibrated to our Moss Landing water. And then we'll be deploying those in nylon mesh bags at the Highway 1 bridge and at the Morro Cove Slough. And we'll be cycling those through about every 2 months. And so the idea is that we know the baseline concentration of these metals in these mussels, and then we deploy them in the slough, and we go back and collect them 2 months later and see if they've accumulated any of this cobalt or nickel. And then we'll just keep doing that cycle because, as Ivana was talking about, once we start moving these metals, they don't necessarily go away. They could go out of the system, but there's going to be lots of transformations that are happening where the metals become more bioavailable or less bioavailable, locked up in the sediments. Maybe bioturbation is going to remobilize those sediments back into the water column where they're going to maybe convert into a more bioavailable species of cobalt or nickel. And so the idea is that we track these mussels. We do this over time to kind of just monitor what the filter feeders are seeing in the slough. And then coupling that with, ideally the upper slough, I think, is a really good area to look at inverts and filter feeders. And so looking at clams up there, Elkhorn Slough Foundation and Amanda are doing lots of collections of different inverts around the slough at various stations. And, they've been out pretty soon after the fire to start that work. And so there'll be a good baseline and be able to monitor those other species of through time as they keep going back and doing more collections every month.
And Ivana, you've been studying, Elkhorn Slough's soils for over a decade. What specifically about Slough's soils or wetland soils in general would cause unique or maybe specific interactions with heavy metals? And I know that David also asked a sort of similar question, what historically has been the impact of large concentrations of heavy metals on life forms in the marsh and estuarine system? I'm wondering what specifically about marsh and wetland soils, what qualities are in these soils that might interact in a certain way with heavy metals. I think Wesley also said that they lock them in somehow. I guess for the less, for someone who doesn't really study soil science and how soil interacts with heavy metals, what can you tell that about for us?
These are really good questions. The first one, can you repeat the first one though? I kind of broke up for a second.
Yeah, sorry if I broke up.
No, no worry.
So the first question is what specifically about wetland soils or Elkhorn Slough soils um, make it so that they interact with heavy metals in a certain way?
Well, so thank you. So so as Wes was saying, so there are different things going on here. One is the physical aspect, like really literally where those metal particles have settled and how they're moving physically. Then there's the chemical transformation. And so right now, well, potentially right now, they're still in an oxidized form. So they're kind of not as reactive as they could be. But eventually, as they move through different redox, as they move into more reducing environments. So, now they're at the very surface, but if they start going, in the subsurface, then they might start leaching out some of the metals, which in turn might combine with other elements. That's where the bioavailability might comes in. Now, in places like Elkhorn Slough, that boundary between oxidizing and reducing conditions is very, very shallow, like a few millimeters. You peel off the very top and it's already black and stinky because of hydrogen sulfide, because of sulfate reduction. So the microbes are reducing are oxidizing the carbon and reducing the sulfate, and they create this very anoxic condition where the actual metals might become more prone to leach out from that from the nanospheres where they are right now. So that's why the wetlands can be a place where the bioavailability of those metals might become enhanced because of the reducing environment. This is mostly that, not just the soil. The soil varies. You got more clay-rich, more sand-rich. It's not really the soil per se. It's the actual chemical profile of the soil that might control the availability of this metal and their ability to go in solution. That's the other thing, because right now they're in a little, again, they're in a solid phase, but they might actually go in solution. So they might get in the groundwater. So this is the other thing that we're going to be measuring with WES, which is we're going to be looking at whether the pore water, the water that's in the pore between the sediment is getting enriched with those metals. So that will give us a sense as to whether that process is happening, and then we'll trace these metals as they move through the different components of the ecosystem. Does that make sense? Wes, did I say this correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's important to note that both cobalt and nickel are micronutrients. We need those animals, need those metals. So at low concentrations like cobalt, vitamin B12, it's very useful for organisms. Nickel's involved in much enzyme pathways for animals. But at the levels that Ivano's been seeing, those same metals can lead to growth reduction and um, cell damage, and are not good for animals in contact with those. And then Ivano's spot on with kind of really looking at what environment in those marsh sediments, because they're so dynamic with the redox layer and with um, physical processes moving those sediments around. You have a lot of critters in the sediments moving material around, and you can just to kind of cap what he was saying, you can just think about these metals kind of at the bottom, or kind of the less available forms. I'm gonna nerd out here on some chemistry, but it's going to be those kind of sulfide complexes. And then you're going to get into that zone that Ivano was talking about, where you can get the more available, and those are going to be those oxides. And then in the water, they're going to be attached to particulates, maybe organic matter. And that's where we really start to see that being bioavailable for these animals, and all the way up to then these dissolved forms of these metals. And there's just going to be this rapid cycling of this material. We hypothesize there's going to be this rapid cycling, and you can almost think about it possibly, we have to go out and get the data for this, but we might be peeling off over time this kind of bioavailable fraction from this large reservoir that's in the sediment.
And there's the plants too, which which adds a whole another layer. And and the plants are above the soil, but they have a nice surface area. They have texture, so it's like having an umbrella. So right now we're looking at what's underneath the umbrella, but really, there's a whole, and those plants are gonna die. They're gonna get in the soil, and eventually, again, the cycling that Wes was mentioning.
And also beyond the scope of that umbrella, someone here today is also a former Moss Landing Marine Laboratory researcher, it seems. David McGuire, he was interested in the shoreline and more open ocean impacts of this event. Is someone tracking that? And because it's open water, I'm sure it's a bit harder to track, but how are the transport systems and processes different there? And is that something you're looking into as well?
We just met to talk about it like half an hour ago. You want to take that one, Wes, or?
Sure. So Dr. Grand at Moss Landing Marine Labs is starting to do transects down the main channel of the slough. He's been out a couple of times looking at kind of the salt water, these metals in the salt water. That analysis gets very difficult, as you can imagine, as you're looking at trace heavy metals in the stew of seawater. So it's pretty expensive work, but he's out there doing that. I think that's going to give us an indication as to, it's a first start at seeing whether this material is going to be mobilized. I mean, one could imagine that it will find its way out, but we don't have any data at this point for that. I mean, the canyon is sitting right at the mouth of Moss Landing there, and so it's a great question. I would say, there hasn't been a lot done on that. We have just had conversations on whether we do need to kind of at some point expand out to the seafloor.
And in terms of remediation, I know when we last talked, it didn't seem like there was much possibility for it. Are there talks of remediation or some sort of cleanup happening, and what could they be?
Well, not that I'm familiar. Um, um, and I think that there's still a lot of exploration going on as to whether, as I mentioned earlier, what we know is that this deposit is a very thin deposit. So it's an asphalt layer. It's not, again, an avalanche. So unless the metals start moving through the soil, then, obviously the portion of the soil will become thick. The portion that has a higher concentration will become thicker, although that's also a factor of dilution. So and what we know, another thing that we know, I think it would be interesting to share is that if you sample the very, very surface, you get certain so a concentration. What is a concentration? It's something relative to something else, right? So if you have a drop of oil and you put it in a glass, you have a certain concentration of oil. If you put it in a gallon bucket, then it's going to be a lower concentration. So it's always relative to something. So if you sample the soil, if you take a scoop of 1 inch of soil and you mix it up and you put in an instrument and you subsample a quarter of a gram, that's how those analyses are done, then you're going to see very low numbers because you're just mixing it up. But if you sample carefully the very surface, knowing what you're looking for, and you measure the concentration, you can see much higher numbers. So, and that's kind of the dance that's going on with numbers. You'll see numbers published by different people. The question is always, what are they actually representing? What is their, what relative to what? That doesn't make sense. So that's really important. So the remediation is also has to take that in account, because if, say, that heavy metal layer is 1 millimeter, then it might be, and I don't know, I mean, I'm not a specialist on that, just the caveat, but maybe just tilling the soil with, 1 foot of soil will bring it down to such a concentration that becomes, within the, the baseline kind of concentration. So that can be one way to go about it, I guess. But I just learned one thing last week, which I didn't know about. What is it? Dilution is solution to pollution. So apparently, I didn't know that one, but apparently that's the way it works. If so, and one thing that's interesting, I mean, in my experience in the last month, is that us scientists, and I'm saying that with much respect to everybody else. I mean, it's just a job, but we work in a way that we try to answer questions rather than follow procedures. So we constantly adapt our sampling, our mind to what we're trying to understand, rather than other type of analytical approaches done by like government agency, which have more like they're following like a standard. They have to do this and this and this and this. And if their procedure does not account for the actual stuff they're trying to learn, then they just don't, because they're just checking those boxes here. You see what I'm saying? So if your procedure to understand whether soil is contaminated to scoop out 1 inch of soil, you're not going to find anything, because you're diluting, the actual uppermost layer that I mentioned earlier in the much larger specimen. Does it make sense? So we don't have to follow. We follow the scientific approach. That's what we do. But you don't have to follow any specific procedure. If not, when we're using, of course, instrumentation and well-known techniques. But our strategy is always to learn, not to just check boxes. I hope that makes sense to you all. So that also accounts for some difference you might see in the numbers. And the other thing that Wes mentioned again, that the field measurements are surface measurements. So we look at this because that's what exactly you want to look for. You don't want to know what's 1 foot below. You want to know what happened at the very surface after the fire. I mean, right?
And I know that, it's going to take a while to see the effects of the event on wildlife, especially higher up the food chain, but are there are there worries that you guys have, and what particular species or what parts of wildlife, maybe location-wise or species-wise, are you most worried about as for wildlife in the slough?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Ivana, you want me to take this one?
Sure. I mean, we don't know. That's gonna,
Yeah.
so that's
So
what we're doing. We're trying
yeah,
to,
we don't know. I mean, I think the point is that, we can think about this in terms of mass of cobalt that was potentially put into Elkhorn Slough, and Ivano kind of ran through those numbers, and so the metal is going to be somewhere between 0 and the total amount of that metal in the cathode battery before ignition. And so I don't think it's 0. I don't think anybody thinks it's 0. I
no,
also don't think it's, 270 metric tons. I don't think it's all of it. I mean, there's still battery on site. But it's like, even if you just do like 10% of that, we're talking about 27 metric tons of cobalt. That's a lot of cobalt. And, we can hypothesize that that's going to get into the food web, and then we can go out there and look at it. I would say at this point, the way I look at it is there's been an addition. I don't think anybody could argue this point. There's been an additional stressor on the biota in the slough as a result of this fire, a potential additional stressor of cobalt and nickel. Now, you know, maybe it all just gets buried and, isn't bioavailable. Maybe that happens, you know, um, based on literature and looking at how these metals move through marsh sediments, salt marsh environments. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think there's going to be some fraction of that that's mobilized.
yeah. Yeah. And if I can add also, when you think about the food web, this kind of, you know, triangle or pyramid, so in which the top predators sit on top, and that can be the marine mammals, the iconic sea otters and such. So the base of the food web might be picking up the metals in different ways. So what we're going to be learning, like, the Auster experiment is, or different types of invertebrates will might or might not pick up those metals. So eventually what makes it up to the food chain depends on, very much what happens at the bottom of it. So that's the part that we're studying now, really, because before it gets, as you said, before it gets all the way up there, it's going to take time and, processing. But right now we are looking at this base here. And that's what our colleagues, by the way, Wes mentioned Amanda, that's Amanda Khan, who's our colleague invertebrate ecologist here. And Max Grand is also our chemist. So we have a great team here in Moss Landing. We're very lucky. It's a very multidisciplinary lab. So we kind of all do different things. And this is actually bringing us together because we have all these different expertise. So I'm very thankful, to have colleagues like Wes and Amanda and Max.
Same.
All right, one more question from me before we open it up to Q&A from the guests, but has there been any uncertainty with regards to federal funding and a lot of, everything that's been happening in the news with funding freezing, with layoffs? Will that affect any of the work being done at the slough, especially after the fire?
Um,
Make
I'll
a
just,
wild guess.
yeah, I'll briefly just jump in on maybe just
Please.
a situation that I had with, we want to work with federal agencies, and we have these samples, and I've got to be honest, if 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 the the federal organizations right now have been really helpful, and like NOAA, contacts at NOAA, and the the thing is, though, is if we're going to collaborate and give them samples that we've collected for them to help us, I just personally, I'm not sure they're going to actually be there next month to be able to analyze those samples with all of the funding freezes that I'm reading about in the headlines. So I guess that's, from my position as a scientist at Moss Landing, that's how I'm thinking about the current situation. Just like, what's the stability of some of these really awesome federal environmental organizations. And then I guess the other side would just be the federal funding would normally be National Science Foundation for work like this rather than NIH, but it does kind of give pause to putting large proposals together and trying to get funding through NSF right now.
Thank you for sharing.
Well, I think I can hop back on now as we transition to the Q&A section with the guests. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on the people's names who have entered questions into the chat. And you should be able to unmute yourself at this point. And please just unmute, ask your question, and then Ivano and Wesley can respond. So I think we're just going to start at the top. We have a question from David's second question. David Donenfield, do you mind unmuting and asking your question, David?
I think you might have to unmute them too, Leah.
Let's see.
I'm unmuted.
There
I'll turn my camera on for this question. Whoops, there we go. I'll just read from what I wrote, but it has to do with the moderator's phrasing of a similar question, which is, so I know it's too early to provide definitive answers, and I know you're not marine biologists or specialists in estuary and biological systems, but from what you've read and spoken to other experts about, what would you be most concerned about regarding the deleterious effects of heavy metal contamination of Elkhorn Slough with its complex life forms, all the different species, and the fact that it's a saltwater estuarine system? Is there nothing to be concerned about, or is there a potential catastrophe at hand?
Wes is looking at me. I think so. One thing I want to say is that what is it? Day 40. I haven't slept much in the last 40 days because we're trying to manage field work, interviews, everything else. So I have a lot to read. I can't wait to have a break in which I can actually read papers because they takes time. And so I'm looking forward to read more papers on. I actually have a collection of papers that discuss some of your questions. But I think that Wes kind of already gave you an answer, which is there's a potential. I think it's probably going to be between 0 and catastrophe. If that's my guess. But the things that Wes mentioned earlier about cobalt and nickel being entering potentially the food web and become bioavailable is really our concern because they bioaccumulate. I mean, the concern is they might actually concentrate towards the top of the pyramid I was mentioning earlier. But I don't have any specific reference to papers because I really didn't have time to read them. I'm very honest about it. And I have thousands of data that I'm chewing through trying to understand the story. So I don't know, Wes, do you want to?
I mean, I guess I would just reiterate what I said before around just focusing on cobalt and nickel, that both of these metals are micronutrients. They're essential for life, but at excessive levels. So I'll just say again, like we could just, look at cell damage, impaired growth, and reproductive issues on animals for cobalt, and for nickel, reduced growth and interference with cellular respiration. And so those we know are the symptoms of high exposure in animals to those two metals. And so then we can just think about those animals in the slough, if they are exposed to those high levels, how is that going to affect the food web? And yes, both of these metals will biomagnify up the food chain. So the higher you are on the trophic level, the higher the concentrations likely are in your prey if those metals are being taken up into that food web.
mercury is a great analogy. You know, that's what has been studied, right? It's the same kind of process.
Yeah, they same process with just different
Right.
speciation. That's
Right. Different
the
speciation.
toxic form, but yep.
And I see another question that's very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Because those are good questions. I mean, obviously, those are the questions, but they're, you know, yeah, that's what we really need to figure out and learn.
Thank you, David, for your question, and Yvonne and Wesley for your responses. Our next question is from Gina. Gina, do you mind unmuting? I'm also happy to read people's questions out loud if they would prefer, but Gina had a question about the metal.
Yes, hi. Hope you can hear me. Basically, my question is that there is a lot of value, meaning need for these three metals, and there is shortage of them. And I'm wondering whether they can be collected for reuse. And is anyone looking at that possibility, which would, in addition to the value from the metals, it would also help the environment? Because would be removing them instead of just waiting and seeing what will happen.
So okay, I can tell you what I heard on TV yesterday. I think there was an interview in relation to the dismantling of what is left of the Vistra facility, and they were talking about was one like an EPA? I think it was an EPA person. They were talking about recycling, trying to recycle some of the material. So I think that they'll try to do that concerning, you know, the actual locate, you know, the battery facility. But for what concerns the soils, I don't see any way to, if that's your question, to recycle to those metals. I mean, they're still occurring in parts per million. I mean, it's that you know, they could be toxic in very small concentration, but we're talking about, you know, the majority of the places it's like a couple hundred parts per million. So even when I look at them on a scanning electron microscope, it takes me a while to find them. I mean, even if you have 1,000 parts per million, it means that 1 out of 1,000 particles is a heavy metal particle. So finding them takes 1,000 screenshots. So they're very low concentration from that point of view. I don't know if Wes has anything to add.
Yeah, like a postage stamp in the state of Texas.
Yeah,
what
yeah,
we're talking about here.
yeah. So when I work on a microscope, I really spend like a day just to get, you know, to visualize one, just because of the low numbers. But I think they're trying to recycle some of the material from. I mean, that's what I heard on
The on-site material that that is still there. Yeah, because.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, Gina.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. Our next question comes from Michelle. Michelle, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Hello, thank you. I have actually two questions. One is the battery site going to be rebuilt back into a power plant? And the second question is, does this fire event set a precedent going forward for mandatory major fire suppression systems for other lithium battery sites? Does anyone know that?
I can help answer that question. These are just conversations that I've had with the fire chief, who was present at the site for the past few weeks. He isn't able to make official statements, but he has been talking to Vistra Energy officials, project managers, and contractors. He's been in multiple meetings with them, and it seems like they're not going to be opening back up again. They're not going to be rebuilding. That's what he's heard, and that's what I've heard through him. So I wouldn't take that officially, but that's what he said. As of whether there's going to be any sort of precedence for any sort of standards or regulation improvements, that's what this lawsuit is trying to advocate for. They're demanding a full investigation into the cause of the fire, which Vistra hasn't released yet, actually. Compensation for damages, and then also industry-wide adoption of safety standards and fire prevention measures.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jillian, for that. And we have a question from Monique. Monique, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
It doesn't look like Monique.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I'm not Monique. My name is Rike Jefferson, but I work as part of the Ilcon's research team. my question is that we are already collecting water samples every month. If we filter 60 milliliters of sample and save the filter, would that be enough dissolved organic matter on it to detect heavy metals, or is our volume too small? Is our filter wrong? What do you think? Because then we could save the filters for later analysis.
I think that work is, so that work for trace metals is really, really difficult. And like, what type of filter are you using? If you're using glass fiber, then probably not.
Okay,
Yeah.
bummer.
And but the good news is that Dr. Grand is doing that work in the slough as well. And so, we can, share that data as it comes out.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Monique. Let's see, we have a question from Karen asking about Karen. Yeah, do you mind unmuting?
Yeah, sure. So most of the, this is a fabulous talk, by the way. I hope you put it on Facebook so I can share with friends and stuff. Most of the talk has been right around the Elkhorn Slough or Moss Landing area. And I was wondering about what further reaching effects are, like friends who live, within 20 miles. Do they have to worry about the toxins there? And I'm thinking about the deer they talk about in their yards, the birds, the owls, the foxes, their dogs, this sort of thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the only thing I know is the citizen science report. There was, you're probably aware of that had the surface measurements, this ghost wipes, which seem to show a pretty large extent of the fallout zone. I think it's a pretty solid data set for what it does, which is looking at the surface again, because that's what it was dust. So, and that's pretty much as far as I can go. I mean, I don't know. I mean, those are all really good questions that should be answered by somebody else. Yeah. And
it would be really great if there was some attention to kind of that boundary of where where should investigations be done, kind of similar to what our group is doing in Elkhorn Slough. And like Ivano started the talk, we're in a small area there at Elkhorn Slough. That's what we're that's what we're able to do. And similar work could be done in other watersheds.
And thank you for correcting me. So, this solution is not the what is it again?
Solution is not the
Solution
is not the solution.
But in this case here it is, because you're not seeing the numbers by so this is the other thing about the mass balance I was talking about, because if the fallout area is widespread, then you're obviously you're getting that deposit over a large area, so you see less concentration but over a large area. So it will be useful to know how far this fallout zone occurred. But it's already been 40 days, so it's getting harder and harder as time goes on to actually measure those things. So probably it's already too late. I mean, the runoff, especially the rains that occurred at the end of January, was so the precipitation was so intense that probably the runoff took care of most of it, I would assume. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think for our last question, we have one from Tenna. Tenna, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Has this happened elsewhere? And what were the results elsewhere when lithium factories have exploded?
Well, this is the largest event ever happened. We know that. We're lucky, I guess. And there have been other fires, other smaller battery fires. I've started reading about it. There was one in Illinois, Morris, Illinois, in 2021. And interestingly, what they found is that the fallout area was again offset relative to the power plant. Actually, kind of a similar situation, although much smaller facility. And so they evacuated actually the wrong area. They learned from that they were actually, their perimeter was completely wasn't accounting for the fact that the fallout doesn't occur at the power where the storage facility. That's the main lesson I learned from that. I don't know if Wes is.
Yeah, I don't have any more to add. Just that, yeah, this I think is the largest scale one so far.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. And I think with that, we can wrap up, but I really want to extend a huge thank you to Wesley and Ivano for sharing this hour with us, sharing their expertise and their experience over the past 40 days with the Bay Nature audience. And thank you, Jillian, for moderating, and thank you everyone who attended for joining for this session. Yeah, we did record it, so we will be sending out a recording to everyone who registered, and yeah, please just tune in for more events like this, and please stay safe and stay well. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
And thank you, Jillian. And I think I wish we had more time, but it's a lot. The questions were really good, and maybe in a few months, maybe in a year, we can have an update or something like that.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I
Okay,
really
great.
appreciate the interest. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, you guys. Everyone really enjoyed that, it seemed.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Okay.
Take
Have a
care.
great day.
Have a good
Bye, Jillian. Bye.
Bye.